2 days ago, the Environmental Protection Agency, they didn't just change a rule. They arguably reset the entire operating system of American environmental law. On February 13th, 2026, the EPA released the final rescission rule. And if you care about how the government functions, this is the most significant document released in the last decade.
Reset is a polite way to put it. I'd call it a demolition. As of 48 hours ago, the federal government has officially decided that the climate crisis is no longer its problem to solve. We are looking at the formal revocation of the 2009 Endangerment Finding, which, that is the legal bedrock that has supported every single climate regulation for the last 17 years.
It was the bedrock, yes. But the question we're wrestling with today is whether that bedrock was ever actually solid, or if it was, built on a swamp of good intentions and, frankly, bad legal theory. The EPA has determined that the 2009 finding was legally flawed from the start. They are arguing that the agency simply lacks the authority to regulate global climate change under the Clean Air Act.
Which is an argument that requires a stunning amount of intellectual gymnastics. To get there, you have to ignore established atmospheric science, you have to ignore the physical reality of what is happening to our weather, and you have to ignore the Supreme Court's 2007 ruling in Massachusetts versus EPA. This isn't just a legal correction. This is the government looking at a burning house and deciding that because the fire hose wasn't explicitly mentioned in the building code from 1970, they aren't allowed to turn the water on.
I understand the urgency in that analogy, but let me offer a different perspective on the building code. My position, and the EPA's position now, is about the rule of law. If the building code doesn't authorize the fire department to restructure the entire neighborhood to prevent fires, then the fire department shouldn't be doing it. The rescission rule asserts that a policy decision of this magnitude, restructuring the American energy economy to fight climate change, that lies solely with Congress. It's a restoration of democratic order.
And my position is that this restoration is actually an abdication. The Clean Air Act was written to protect public health from air pollution. Greenhouse gases are, by definition and by Supreme Court ruling, air pollution. So by walking away from this duty, the EPA is trading abstract legal purity for tangible human suffering. We aren't dealing with law school hypotheticals here. The Environmental Defense Fund projects this specific rollback will lead to 58,000 premature deaths over the next 30 years. That is the cost of your democratic order.
Those are heavy numbers, and we are absolutely going to dig into the cost-benefit analysis later. But first, we have to understand the mechanism. How did they actually do this? Because legally, it's a fascinating maneuver.
It's a maneuver that relies on undoing history. We have to go back to 2009. The endangerment finding was the trigger. The EPA administrator at the time looked at the science and said, yes, these 6 greenhouse gases threaten public health. Once that finding is made, the Clean Air Act is very clear. The EPA must regulate.
Exactly. Section 202A of the Act says, if the administrator finds a pollutant causes harm, they shall regulate it. It's automatic. So the only way to stop the regulation is to kill the finding itself. And the EPA is now arguing that the 2009 finding relied on a profound misreading of the Supreme Court's decision in Massachusetts v. EPA.
That claim is what drives me up the wall. Massachusetts v. EPA is the law of the land. In that case, the Supreme Court explicitly told the EPA, greenhouse gases fit the definition of an air pollutant. You have the authority. Now, the Trump administration's EPA is effectively saying, we think the Supreme Court didn't mean what they said.
Well, hold on. They aren't saying the court didn't say it. They're looking at how the statute is interpreted. The rescission rule, which is this massive 436-page document, it pivots back to the logic of the dissenting opinion in that 2007 case, Justices Scalia, Roberts, Thomas, and Alito. Their argument was that the Clean Air Act was designed for a specific type of problem.
And what type of problem is that?
Local pollution. Think about 1970. The air in Los Angeles was brown. People were getting sick from smog and soot right where they lived. The act was designed to stop you from breathing toxic air in your own neighborhood. It was not designed to address a global phenomenon where CO2 emitted in Detroit mixes with CO2 from Beijing to change the temperature in Antarctica.
But the statute defines air pollutant as
any physical, chemical, substance, or matter which is emitted into or otherwise enters the ambient air. That is incredibly broad language. The Supreme Court majority said Congress made it broad on purpose because they knew they couldn't predict every future threat. By pretending air pollutant only means local smog, the EPA is just rewriting the dictionary to suit a political outcome.
They would argue they are applying a limiting construction to avoid absurdity. And this brings us to the Major Questions Doctrine, which is really the engine driving this whole rescission.
The Major Questions Doctrine has become the universal wrench for dismantling regulation.
It's a necessary check on the administrative state. Let's break this down simply. Think of the Major Questions Doctrine like a spending limit on a corporate credit card. If you are a manager and you want to buy lunch for the team, you don't need the CEO's permission. That's normal business. But if you want to buy a new headquarters building, you absolutely need the board of directors to sign off. You can't just put a skyscraper on the company card.
Okay, I follow the analogy.
The EPA trying to rewire the global energy grid to fight climate change is a buying a new headquarters moment. It is an issue of vast political and economic significance. The EPA is arguing that since the Clean Air Act doesn't explicitly mention climate change or global warming, Congress never signed off on that purchase. Therefore, the agency is overstepping.
Here is where that analogy falls apart for me. The EPA isn't trying to buy a building based on a whim. They are responding to a fact. The endangerment finding is a scientific determination. Does X cause Y? Does CO2 cause warming? Yes, that is a fact. The Major Questions Doctrine is supposed to apply to regulations, to the policy solution. But here, the EPA is using it to suppress the finding of the problem. It seems like a category error, to use a legal doctrine to erase a scientific reality.
But legally, you cannot separate them. That is the trap of Section 202A. As we established, if you make the finding, you must make the regulation. It is a domino effect. If the finding exists, the purchase of the headquarters becomes mandatory. So the EPA argues that making the finding is the major question because it forces the massive economic restructuring. To stop the unauthorized regulation, they have to pull the first domino, the finding itself.
So they are willfully blinding themselves to the science to avoid the responsibility of governing. It's essentially saying, if we admit the house is on fire, we'll be forced to buy a fire truck. And we don't have the budget authority for a truck, so we must legally conclude the house is not on fire.
That's a stark way to put it, but legally, yes. If they lack the authority to fix it, they argue they lack the authority to officially find it in a way that triggers the statute. And this leads directly to their second main argument, futility.
This is where the logic goes from frustrating to dangerous.
Futility is a specific legal concept here. The EPA has done the math. They have determined that repealing the greenhouse gas standards for vehicles, specifically model year 2012 onward, will not have a material impact on global climate indicators through the year 2100.
No material impact? Let's really look at that.
It's a question of scale. The U.S. transportation sector is a fraction of global emissions. You have China, India, the developing world. Their emissions are rising fast. The EPA calculates that the difference between keeping the U.S. standards and repealing them is a fraction of a degree of temperature difference in 80 years.
It's the drop in the bucket fallacy.
But if the regulation imposes massive costs and the administration claims this repeal will save the auto industry and businesses an estimated $1 trillion without actually solving the problem of global warming, isn't it irrational to keep it?
That logic is functionally a suicide pact. If every country says, I'm only 10% of the problem, so my actions are futile, then nobody does anything and the planet cooks. The Supreme Court explicitly told the EPA they couldn't use this excuse in 2007. They said that meaningful reduction is still meaningful even if it doesn't solve the whole problem.
But does the Clean Air Act authorize the EPA to make meaningful contributions that don't actually eliminate the danger? That's the counter-argument. If the danger is global climate change and U.S. tailpipe standards don't stop global climate change, then the regulation fails to meet its statutory purpose. It becomes arbitrary and capricious to force companies to spend $1 trillion on a gesture.
It's not a gesture if it saves lives. The Center for Progressive Reform pointed out that even a tiny percentage reduction in global terms translates to massive numbers of human beings. They noted that 0.01% of the U.S. population sounds immaterial as a statistic, but that is 34,000 people. When you strip away the percentages, you are talking about real asthma attacks, real heart disease, and real deaths.
But are those deaths caused by the CO2 or by other pollutants? Because the EPA is very careful to say they aren't touching the regulations on criteria pollutants like particulate matter or ozone. Those are still fully regulated under the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. This rescission strictly targets the greenhouse gases.
You know, that is a fantasy separation. In the real world, out of a real tailpipe, when you burn more gasoline, you get more CO2 and more soot and more smog precursors. You can't neatly separate them. By giving the green light to burn more carbon, you are inadvertently rolling back progress on conventional pollution too. And regarding that $1 trillion savings, that number is a mirage.
How so? It's direct compliance costs.
Because it ignores the cost of inaction. Climate change is expensive. We are talking about hurricanes wiping out cities, wildfires burning down towns, crop failures driving up food prices. Those cost trillions. The rescission rule treats the cost of climate damages as zero because, according to their futility logic, U.S. action alone doesn't stop it. It's bad economics disguised as legal prudence.
I see your point on the economics, but the administration is looking at the immediate impact on industry. And frankly, the rhetoric surrounding this gives us a clue into their thinking. You have Interior Secretary Doug Burgum recently on TV saying, plants need CO2 to survive.
It's embarrassing. It's a talking point for a middle school debate club, not the United States government. Yes, plants need CO2. Humans need water. But if I hold your head underwater, you still drown. It ignores the heat waves, the ocean acidification, the drought. When top officials say things like that, it makes it hard to believe this is about statutory interpretation and not just anti-science ideology.
I agree that the plants need CO2 line is simplistic. But interestingly, the rescission rule itself is much smarter than the Secretary's TV appearances. The rule explicitly states it is not premised on new scientific findings. It actually discusses a climate science alternative basis, where they look at uncertainties in the models, but they explicitly say we aren't relying on that.
Why do you think they're doing that?
Because it's safer in court. If they argue climate change is a hoax, they get laughed out of the D.C. Circuit because the scientific record is overwhelming. But if they argue the Clean Air Act doesn't give us the power to fix it, regardless of whether it's real, that is a purely legal question. It's a question of authority, not science. It shields them from having to debate the physics.
It's a distinction without a difference for the people living in flood zones. But we need to talk about the scope of this. This isn't just about cars, is it?
No. And this is where the insight really lies. The rescission rule isn't just about tailpipes. The logic they are using, that GHGs are not air pollutants under Section 202A, effectively applies to the whole Clean Air Act. The EPA has deferred action on power plants for the moment, but the writing is on the wall. If the endangerment finding goes, the legal basis for regulating power plants, oil and gas wells, and the greenhouse gas reporting program, it vanishes.
It wipes the slate clean. No federal climate policy, period.
And that creates a vacuum. But here's the twist that I think is the most legally aggressive part of the rule. Usually when the feds step back, the states step up. We've seen California do this for decades.
Right, the California waiver. Under the Clean Air Act, California is usually allowed to set stricter standards because they had air pollution laws before the federal government did.
Usually, but the rescission rule contains a poison pill for the states. It argues that Clean Air Act preemption continues to apply by its own force.
Explain that, because this is the checkmate move.
So the Clean Air Act says states generally cannot regulate tailpipe emissions to prevent a patchwork of laws. The only exception is if the EPA grants California a waiver. The EPA is now saying, we don't have the authority to regulate GHGs, therefore we cannot grant a waiver for GHGs, and because the Clean Air Act preemption is still in the statute, states are still forbidden from regulating them.
It is the dog in the manger strategy. The federal government says, we won't do it, and simultaneously tells the states, and you can't do it either.
Precisely. They're arguing that Congress intended for a uniform national standard. even if that standard is nothing, it has to be uniform. They want to prevent a scenario where California dictates the engine standards for the whole country. They are protecting the interstate market from fragmentation.
They're using the Clean Air Act and environmental protection law as a shield to prevent environmental protection. This is going to cause absolute chaos. Environmental groups in blue states have already filed suit in the D.C. Circuit. But think about the business uncertainty. I mean, the auto companies have long lead times. They don't know if this rule will survive court. If they stop investing in EVs and hybrids now, and then the court throws this rule out in 3 years, they're totally behind the curve.
That is the risk. But notice the auto industry isn't screaming too loudly yet. The promise of saving that $1 trillion in compliance costs is a powerful sedative. And frankly, the EPA is betting on the current makeup of the judiciary. They know this is going to the Supreme Court. They know the 2007 Massachusetts decision was 5-4. The makeup of the court is very different now. They are betting that the current court will look at the major questions doctrine and agree that the EPA went too far.
So we are looking at years of litigation while the carbon clock just keeps ticking.
Likely, yes. But the advocate would remind us this forces the conversation back to Congress. If the American people want climate regulation, they should elect a Congress that will pass a specific climate act rather than relying on a creative reading of a 1970 law.
We have been waiting for Congress to act for 30 years. The system is gridlocked. The Clean Air Act was the safety net. Cutting the safety net because you don't like how it was woven while the acrobat is falling is reckless.
Reckless or constitutionally necessary? That is the debate.
It feels like we are debating the arrangement of deck chairs on the Titanic, and the EPA just decided to throw the lifeboats overboard because they weren't explicitly authorized in the original ship blueprints.
A vivid image, but the EPA would say they are simply steering the ship back to the charted course of the law.
We will see what the D.C. Circuit says about that course.
Indeed. This is going to be the defining legal battle of the next few years. We will be watching the filings closely.
And we will keep debating the consequences.
Thanks for listening.